The spring of 1945 arrived in Bavaria like a whisper of something ending. The air carried the scent of thaw and distant smoke, and in the gray morning light, the war felt both impossibly close and already fading into memory. In a military command post outside Munich, Oberst Heinrich Müller stood at his desk. Staring at a stack of orders, he could no longer bring himself to execute. He was 42 years old, a career officer who had once believed in duty above all else, and now he believed in nothing but the weight pressing against his chest every time he put on his uniform. Müller had joined the Wehrmacht in a different era, when the promise of national restoration seemed like salvation rather than damnation. He had been decorated twice, had led men through campaigns in France and the Eastern Front, and had earned the respect of superiors who valued precision and loyalty. But somewhere between the orders and the executions, between the directives signed in Berlin and the consequences he witnessed in villages whose names he would never forget, something inside him had broken, or perhaps it had finally awakened. He was no longer certain which. On the morning of April 23rd, as Allied forces pushed deeper into southern Germany and the sound of artillery grew louder each day, Heinrich Müller walked out of his office, left his service revolver on the desk, and disappeared. No farewell, no explanation. His adjutant found the empty room an hour later and assumed the worst, or perhaps the best, depending on one's perspective. Desertion in the final days of the Reich was common enough that one more missing officer barely warranted investigation. The assumption was simple. Müller had either fled or taken his own life in some remote corner of the collapsing empire. Either way, he became a footnote, a name crossed off a roster, a mystery that no one had time to solve. But Müller had not run to save himself. He had run to finish something he had started 2 years earlier, something that required him to vanish completely so that others might survive. The war ended, as all wars do, in a mixture of relief and ruin. Germany lay divided and devastated, its cities reduced to rubble, its people scattered and broken. In the years that followed, the world tried to make sense of what had happened, to assign blame and extract justice, to rebuild and remember. But some stories remained buried, lost beneath the soil and the silence of those who knew but would not speak. In 1947, a man named Jakob Hartmann returned to his family's farm in the Bavarian countryside, a few kilometers outside the village of Poling. He had survived the war by luck and circumstance. Too old for frontline duty, assigned to logistics, he had spent most of the conflict moving supplies and avoiding the worst of the fighting. When it ended, he came home to find his fields overgrown, his barn half collapsed, and his wife waiting with their young son Thomas, who barely remembered what peacetime looked like. Jakob did not speak much about the war. Like many men of his generation, he buried it beneath the work of rebuilding, focusing on the soil and the seasons, and the quiet hope that the future might be better than the past. The farm was modest, 30 hectares of fields, a small orchard, a few dairy cows. Jakob worked it with the determination of someone who needed the labor to keep darker thoughts at bay. Thomas grew up helping his father, learning to plow and plant, to repair fences and mend tools, and to appreciate the rhythms of rural life that had persisted through centuries of upheaval. By the time Thomas was a teenager, he could handle the tractor as well as his father, and when Jakob's health began to decline in the late 70s, it was understood that Thomas would take over the farm. In the spring of 1982, Thomas Hartmann was 37 years old, married with 2 children of his own, and working a section of land his father had always avoided, a field at the eastern edge of the property, rocky and difficult, where the soil was thin and the drainage poor. Jakob had always said it wasn't worth the trouble, but Thomas was stubborn and needed the extra acreage. He spent weeks clearing stones and preparing the ground, and on a cool April morning, as he guided the plow through the earth, the blade struck something that sent a jarring vibration up through the machinery. Thomas stopped, shut off the engine, and climbed down to investigate. He expected a boulder or an old piece of farm equipment, something that would require an hour's work to dig out and haul away. Instead, he found himself staring at a corner of rusted metal protruding from the dirt. A box, military green beneath the corrosion, about the size of a large suitcase. He knelt and began to dig with his hands, pulling away clumps of damp earth until he could see the whole container. It was an ammunition box, the kind used by the Wehrmacht, sealed with a heavy latch that had rusted shut. Thomas carried it back to the barn, his curiosity outweighing any caution. He pried the latch open with a crowbar, and when the lid finally gave way, he found himself looking at a collection of items carefully wrapped in oilcloth, papers, photographs, a leather-bound journal, a set of military insignia, and a folded uniform jacket. The smell of old paper and damp fabric rose from the box, and Thomas realized with a strange shiver that he was holding pieces of someone's life, deliberately hidden and waiting to be found. The journal was the first thing he examined. The handwriting inside was precise and controlled, the German script elegant, despite the circumstances in which it must have been written. The first entry was dated July 1943, and the name at the top of the page was Oberst Heinrich Müller. Thomas did not recognize the name, but he recognized the tone. This was not a soldier's diary of battles and camaraderie. This was a confession. Thomas spent that evening reading by lamplight in his kitchen, his wife asleep upstairs, the children long since tucked into bed. Müller's words were careful and deliberate, each entry a small piece of a larger picture. He wrote about orders that disturbed him, about colleagues who spoke too freely of things that should never have been spoken aloud, about the slow realization that he was serving something monstrous. There were no grand declarations, no melodramatic revelations, just the quiet, accumulating horror of a man watching himself become complicit. By August 1943, Müller had begun to document specific incidents. A transport of civilians diverted to a camp he knew would be their final destination. An order to execute captured partisans without trial. A report he was asked to sign that listed casualties as military targets when he knew they were villagers. He did not refuse these orders, not yet, but he wrote them down as if creating a record might somehow absolve him or at least bear witness to what was happening. Then, in October 1943, the entries changed. Müller wrote about a conversation with a colleague, an intelligence officer named Dietrich, who had hinted at his own doubts, his own quiet acts of sabotage. It was coded language, careful and ambiguous, but the meaning was clear to anyone reading closely. Müller had found someone else who saw what he saw, who felt what he felt, and who was doing something about it. The next entries detailed Müller's involvement in what he called the network, a loose collection of officers, bureaucrats, and civilians who passed information to the Allies, who falsified documents to save lives, who found ways to delay or divert orders that would result in executions. It was not organized resistance in the traditional sense, not a coordinated conspiracy with leaders and objectives. It was improvisation, desperation, small acts of defiance that might mean the difference between life and death for a handful of people. Müller documented each action meticulously, perhaps because he knew that if he was discovered, the evidence would matter, or perhaps because he needed to prove to himself that he was doing something, however inadequate, to fight back. Thomas read through the night, unable to stop. The journal detailed 2 years of clandestine work, false identity papers created for Jewish families, intelligence reports deliberately altered to protect resistance cells, transport orders changed to reroute prisoners away from execution sites. Müller estimated he had saved perhaps 200 lives, though he could never be certain. He wrote about the constant fear of discovery, the paranoia that accompanied every forged signature, every intercepted message. He wrote about the colleagues he suspected but could not trust, the superiors he despised but had to obey, the impossible balance between maintaining his cover and doing enough to matter. And then, in April 1945, as the war entered its final days, Müller wrote about his decision to disappear. The network had been compromised. Someone had talked, or been captured, or simply made a mistake. Müller knew that the Gestapo was closing in, that arrests were imminent, and that anyone connected to the resistance would be executed along with their families. His final entries were instructions, a kind of testament. He described the location where he would hide certain documents, the names of people who needed to be warned, the steps he would take to draw attention away from the others. And then on April 22nd, he wrote a single line, "Tomorrow I leave. If this is found, let it speak for what I could not say aloud." Thomas sat back in his chair as dawn light began to filter through the kitchen windows. He understood now why the box had been buried in that particular field. It was remote, unlikely to be disturbed, and yet marked in a way that someone, eventually, might find it. Müller had left a message for the future, a record of choices made in the darkest of times, and Thomas held that message in his hands. But the journal was not the only thing in the box. There were photographs, some formal military portraits, others candid shots of villages and people whose faces bore the unmistakable marks of suffering. There were documents, forged identity papers with Miller's signature, transport orders with altered destinations, letters from people thanking him in veiled language for help they could not explicitly name. And there was a map, hand-drawn, showing a route through the Bavarian Alps with a single notation: final refuge. Thomas knew he could not keep this discovery to himself. This was history, evidence of something that mattered. He contacted the local historical society, which referred him to a professor at the University of Munich, Dr. Anna Schreiber, who specialized in World War II resistance movements. When Thomas called her and described what he had found, there was a long silence on the other end of the line, and then she said simply, "I'll be there tomorrow." Anna Schreiber arrived the next afternoon, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an intensity that suggested she took her work very seriously. Thomas showed her the box, and she spent hours examining each item, photographing documents, taking notes, handling everything with the careful reverence of someone who understood the weight of what she was looking at. When she finally looked up, her expression was a mixture of excitement and sadness. "This is extraordinary," she said. "Heinrich Müller's name appears in a few records. He was reported missing in April 1945, presumed dead or deserted, but there was never any indication of his involvement in resistance activities. If this journal is authentic, and I believe it is, this changes our understanding of how many officers were working against the regime from within." Together, Thomas and Anna began to piece together Müller's final days. The map in the box led them to the village of Oberammergau, a small mountain community near the Austrian border. Anna contacted local historians and tracked down elderly residents who might remember the spring of 1945. Most had vague memories at best. It had been nearly 40 years, and the end of the war was a chaotic blur for everyone. But one woman, Frau Edeltraud Zimmermann, now 86 years old and living in a small cottage with a view of the Alps, remembered something. Anna and Thomas visited her on a gray afternoon in May. She served them coffee and almond cake in a sitting room filled with photographs and knitted blankets, and when Anna explained why they had come, Frau Zimmermann's eyes grew distant, as if she were looking back through decades. "There was a man," she said slowly, "an officer. He came to the village in late April, just before the Americans arrived. He was alone, no staff, no vehicle. He walked in from the mountains, and he looked exhausted, like he had been traveling for days. My father gave him a meal and a place to sleep in our barn. I was 17 then, and I remember being frightened. We all were. Soldiers passing through usually meant trouble. But this one was different. He was quiet, polite. He barely spoke. Do you remember his name?" Anna asked. Frau Zimmermann shook her head. "He did not give one, but I remember his eyes. They were haunted, like he carried the weight of 1,000 souls. He stayed 2 nights, helped my father repair a fence, and then one morning he was gone. My father found a note thanking us, and a small amount of money, more than we had seen in years. We never knew who he was or what happened to him." Anna showed her one of the photographs from the box, a formal portrait of Heinrich Müller in his Wehrmacht uniform. Frau Zimmermann studied it for a long moment and then nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, "that could be him. Older, more worn, but yes, that could be the man." Anna pressed gently. "Did your father ever mention where the officer might have gone?" He said the man asked about trails into the high mountains, places where someone could disappear. My father warned him that it was still snow-covered up there, dangerous even for experienced climbers. But the man just smiled and said he had nowhere else to go. Thomas and Anna left the cottage with a clearer picture. Müller had made his way to Oberammergau, rested briefly, and then headed into the mountains, not to escape to Austria, but to vanish completely. Whether he intended to wait out the end of the war or simply wanted to disappear into the wilderness, they would likely never know. Search and rescue records from that period were non-existent, and the mountains had claimed many lives over the years. Back in Munich, Anna began the painstaking work of verifying Müller's account. She cross-referenced names mentioned in the journal with survivor testimonies, checked transport records against his documented alterations, contacted archives in Israel and the United States looking for evidence of the people he claimed to have saved. The work took months, but slowly, confirmations emerged. A family in Berlin whose false papers bore Müller's signature and who had survived the war because of it. a resistance cell in Stuttgart that had avoided capture thanks to intelligence warnings that matched Miller's timeline, a transport manifest showing prisoners rerouted to a labor camp instead of an extermination center, the change initialed by an officer whose handwriting matched Miller's. By the fall of 1982, Anna had compiled enough evidence to publish her findings. The article appeared in a leading historical journal, detailing the discovery of Miller's journal and the verification of his resistance activities. It caused a stir in academic circles and beyond. Here was a high-ranking Wehrmacht officer who had worked from within to save lives, who had documented his actions and then disappeared rather than face capture or glory. The story resonated because it complicated the narrative, because it showed that even within the machinery of evil, there were those who chose differently. Thomas Hartmann found himself unexpectedly at the center of attention. Journalists wanted interviews, historians wanted access to the farm, descendants of those Miller had saved reached out with gratitude and tears. It was overwhelming, but Thomas felt a strange sense of duty to see it through. This was not about him. It was about making sure Miller's story was told, that his choices were acknowledged, that the record reflected the complexity of what had happened. In the spring of 1983, exactly a year after Thomas discovered the box, a small memorial was erected at the edge of the field where it had been buried. It was a simple stone marker, inscribed with Miller's name, his dates of service, and a single line: he chose conscience over orders. The dedication ceremony was quiet, attended by a few dozen people: historians, journalists, some elderly survivors who had traveled from across Europe to pay their respects. Anna Schreiber spoke about the importance of remembering not just the horrors of the war, but also the individuals who resisted, who made difficult choices, who proved that humanity could persist even in the darkest circumstances. Thomas stood at the back of the small crowd, listening. He thought about his father, Jakob, who had worked this land for decades and never known what lay beneath it. He thought about his own children, who would grow up knowing this story, understanding that history was not just about great leaders and sweeping movements, but also about ordinary people making impossible decisions. And he thought about Heinrich Miller, who had walked into the mountains and never returned, carrying secrets that would remain buried for nearly 40 years until a farmer's plow struck metal in the spring soil. The story did not end there, of course. Research continued, more evidence emerged, more survivors came forward. Miller's name appeared in memorials and museums, cited as an example of resistance from within, proof that not everyone who wore the uniform had been complicit or indifferent. But the full truth of his final days remained elusive. Searches in the mountains around Oberammergau turned up nothing: no remains, no further evidence of his fate. Whether he perished in the snow, found some remote refuge and lived out his days in anonymity, or simply walked until he could walk no more, no one could say with certainty. For Thomas, the mystery was less important than the discovery itself. He had found something that needed to be found, had given voice to someone who had tried to speak through actions rather than words. The field where the box had been buried became a place of quiet reflection for him, somewhere he would go on early mornings or late evenings and think about the weight of choices, the cost of conscience, and the strange paths by which the past reaches forward to touch the present. Anna Schreiber published a book about Miller and the network he had been part of, expanding the story to include other officers and civilians who had worked in secret to save lives. It became a minor bestseller, required reading in some university courses, a contribution to the ongoing effort to understand not just how the Holocaust happened, but how some people resisted it. Anna retired a few years later, satisfied that she had helped bring an important story to light, that she had honored the memory of people who deserved to be remembered. And in Poling, life continued. The farm remained in the Hartmann family. Thomas's children grew up, and eventually his son took over the work, plowing the same fields, tending the same land. The memorial stone remained, weathering slowly in the Bavarian seasons, visited occasionally by researchers or travelers who had read about the discovery and wanted to see the place for themselves. The story became part of the local history, told and retold, a reminder that even the quietest corners of the world hold secrets, and that sometimes those secrets matter more than anyone could have imagined. Heinrich Müller had written in his journal that he hoped, if his account was ever found, it would speak for what he could not say aloud. In that, at least, he had succeeded. His words had been found, his actions verified, his choices acknowledged. He had vanished into history, and history had brought him back, not as a hero without flaws, not as a figure to be idolized or mythologized, but as a man who had faced an impossible situation and tried, in his limited way, to do something that mattered. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps in the end, it was more than enough. It was proof that even when the world descends into darkness, there are those who carry light, however small, however fragile, and refuse to let it go out.